Well, thank you everyone for joining us from near and far. I know we're all very eager for a time when we can do this in person, but I am pleased that this forum does allow people from all over the world to join us as they are today. My name is Amy Thompson, and I am a director in Bonham's Post-War and Contemporary Art Department. Today, we will be discussing the work and life of the artist Yayoi Kusama, particularly her time in New York from 1958 to 1973. We're doing this in the context of the amazing collection of the late Dr. Teruo Hirose, which includes 11 works from this period and which are coming to auction at Bonham's next Wednesday, May 12th at 12 o'clock. Viewings of the collection are now on view at our Madison Avenue location in New York. So if you're in New York and would like to come and see these works, we'd be absolutely delighted to see you over the next few days. Today, I'm absolutely thrilled to be speaking with Midori Yamamura. When Bonham's embarked on the sale of this collection, Midori's book, Yayoi Kusama, Inventing the Singular, was one of the first places I turned to when researching this artist. So it's so wonderful to have you today. Midori is an assistant professor of art history at the City University of New York. She is the author of several books, including the Yayoi Kusama book I just mentioned, as well as Japanese Contemporary Art, Emergence of the Local in the Age of Globalization, which I believe you're working on at the moment. She has taught art history at Hunter College, Pratt Institute, Fordham, and lectured at the Museum of Modern Art. And this fall, Midori will be co-curating a pedagogical exhibition on homeless NYC. So Midori, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me today. And it's an amazing collection, I have to say.
Thank you so much. I know you got to experience it yourself a few days ago. So thank you so much for finding a time to do that and for joining us today. I know I'm absolutely thrilled to be speaking with you, as so many people around the world are excited to hear from you. This is the cover of Midori's book, if you would like to check it out further to this talk. So today, we'll start by discussing Kusama's early years in Japan. She was born in Matsumoto Prefecture, and Midori's fabulous background is actually a photo of the Matsumoto Museum of Art, which includes works by Kusama outside now. So this is a really fitting background. Kusama, of course, as a child during the war and a young adult, she was conscripted to work in a parachute factory. She has always had an interest and an obsession with art and has always wanted to leave Japan, and eventually was able to do that in 1957 when she moved to Seattle initially, and then moved to New York in 1958. Midori, could you just start by telling us a little bit more about her early personal experiences in the city and how life changed for her when she arrived in New York?
Right. I think we tend to think that Kusama's mother was very much like strict, and she was very against her daughter practicing art. But in fact, when you go to her studio, there is a scrapbook by her mother. It's all about Kusama's career in Japan. And she had like maybe 100 different write-ups from newspapers and magazines. It's really amazing that she started showing in like solo exhibition context in 1952, and by 1955 she was pretty well known in Japanese art world.
Right, and it's worth reminding people that she was only in her earlier mid-20s when that was happening.
She came to the United States, I think, like at the age of 27. Mm-hmm. So yeah, she had a pretty significant career in Japan already, which we usually overlook, I think. And then the family was really amazing that when the daughter decided to go to the United States, they paid like maybe half of the annual income revenue for the company which they own. It's a like a plant nursery business which they own. And she came to the United States, and there are so much like in common with Dr. Hirose.
Yes, who we see on our screen here on the right.
Right. I think both of them are very much anti-war, and both of them couldn't really stand this kind of like social conformity which was imposed by the imperial government. And I had a pleasure talking to his family, and he really couldn't wait until, you know, the war was over, and then the day when he was able to come to the United States because of the regulation. I think immigration regulation had changed in the United States in 1952. And I think the United States for him was something that signified like freedom. And then Kusama had a very similar route, and both of them tried not to participate in government's war effort. So it's a very, very interesting personal connection, and I can understand how they clicked with each other.
Right. And they, you know, just to make everyone on the webinar aware of the connection, Kusama moved to New York in 1958. Dr. Hirose moved in 1959. And Dr. Hirose was a cardiothoracic surgeon, but he was very generous with his care, and especially with the Japanese expatriate community, which I'd love for you to talk a bit more about in a second. And he offered care to people like Kusama for reduced cost or zero cost, or in this case, this remarkable case, in exchange for artworks. And that's how they came to meet, despite having so many parallels in Japan before they both emigrated. We've talked a lot about the Japanese community in New York during this time. Can you tell us what size it was? How many Japanese people were in the city at this period?
It was a very, very small community. Apparently, like Japanese could come to the United States after 1952, and this was in 1958. So I don't think there were a lot of Japanese people, but when Kusama came to to New York from Seattle in around like July 2nd, 1958, she writes a letter to Georgia O'Keeffe, so that's why we know exact date when she came to New York City. I think she started communicating with the Japanese community, which was very, very small. It's not a coincidence that she went to Brata Gallery because she knew that there was a Japanese member who was, this was a cooperative gallery, so you have to have a membership and you need to pay certain money. And she also joined, Kusama also joined the same gallery as the person whose name is Nanae Momiyama, sorry, Nanae Momiyama, who was a member of Brata before. So there were like 2 Japanese members in a small cooperative gallery on the 10th Street. I can understand from Kusama's like appointment book that she had mostly Japanese connections and Japanese American connections during this time. And then she was getting a lot of information. I think she met Dr. Hirose through Genichiro Inokuma, who was a very established artist in Japan, and he actually recommended her to study in Paris. So there was a connection from Japan, which continued in New York, and through that connection, I think she met Dr. Hirose.
It's incredible, all these connections that we're going to talk about later on with other artists, but I just think when you have to put yourself pre-internet, but all these connections that were happening around the world, and Kusama wrote to Georgia O'Keeffe, as you said, and there's a claim she wrote to the president of France. I just love hearing these kind of cross-cultural global connections that caused her to come to New York, and then for these two incredible people to meet as well. We'll start by talking about her artworks, of course. On the screen now are two works that we're selling next week, Mississippi River and Hudson River. These are from 1960, so about 2 years after she had moved to New York. And her art did change quite a lot once she moved. Tell us a bit more about her transition, how her art changed when she moved, what was happening around her during this time that these works were made.
I think when she came to the United States, it was really like the time of abstract expressionist art. And then she really speaks about how she tried to get out of that movement by experimenting a lot of different things. And then she came across this, what is known today, infinity net painting. It was never mentioned as infinity net at the time when she was creating. And I think one of the artworks which is on the auction this time, number 5B, it's most probably the transition from the earlier drawings into this kind of like net painting.
Here's number 5B
here
for reference.
Right, and what makes this collection so interesting is that there's a quality, selected through the person's, the collector's view, which is Dr. Hirose's view. And you might think like, maybe she had given her whatever was available, but it wasn't really true that his family member says Dr. Hirose made a studio visit to Kusama, and he was quite an artistic person. I think he wanted to become like a playwright. So there was quite significant connoisseurship that's involved. But when you look at this particular piece, amongst other pieces, it looks very different because this looks like a very experimental piece. And it looks like it's a transition from the earlier piece into Infinity Net, which I have seen the earliest very small white net painting from 1958 in her studio picture. And most probably it comes a little bit earlier. Right. So it seems like this is a very important piece of art.
It is really the final moment before she crosses over to those infinity nets, which she's so famous for now. And then just going back to the river paintings, the red is very interesting. It's something that she started in white, as you've said, and then she moves to red. You see more of the black here than you see in her white works. What caused this change? What was she doing at this time that changed to the red?
Well, when you look at her calendar diary from this time, she was really preparing to show at the Grace Gallery in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
And at that exhibition, I have like the works titles which went into the exhibition, and they were all red. And red was significantly important for Kusama during this time because, for instance, I think the one which she's holding right now in the right-hand side picture is most probably the net painting which she submitted to the Whitney Museum, annual, which she was accepted, I think, at the end of 1960 and beginning of 1961. And that was really a breakthrough piece. So the red painting, we usually don't think, so much about Kusama with the red pieces, but it's very, very important during the year 1960. And when going back to use of black, um, all these white infinity net paintings, she starts painting the background with black, and then
Right.
she paints the net components, and then she covers that with diluted white. So the black is very much like on the base of net painting, but Dr. Hirose's collection is very unique because there is a depth which she realized by using dark painting.
Yeah.
And yeah,
It just the movement she creates with that black and red is feels so special to me. And the title of these works, as I said, they're called Mississippi River and Hudson River, two great American rivers. Can you tell me a bit more about why naming them as such is important, both from Japanese symbolism and in her new life in America?
I think, you know, the way she started net painting was really through the painting called Pacific Ocean.
Mhm.
So the water and the ocean were very important, and especially my mother comes from the same, you know, town as Kusama, and I've grown up by visiting there while I was in attending the elementary school. Um, it's really a secluded place where the tall mountains are, you know, surrounding this very small, tiny town. And maybe everyone's familiar that the back of her house was what is called Suzuki River. The river is always there. But I think from river, you will reach to the ocean. And my mother tells me that, you know, she was very much looking and imagining about the ocean while she was growing up because the
Oh,
town was so secluded. So I think the river is something which is like an avenue to the freedom for her. And
wow.
then the ocean was something very wide. So, and then Hudson River is something which is very familiar to her because she was in New York. I'm not quite sure about Mississippi River, but I think rivers are very important, and there is a connection with water with the original Infinity painting.
Yeah, I think you and I had talked about how she had a bit of an obsession with New York. Didn't she originally live very close to the Empire State Building and she used to like to go see the city from there?
Right. I think the studio she is taking a picture right now is on the 30th Street. It's really like 3 blocks away from Empire State Building. And she remembers going up on the Empire State Building and then stares at the town. And then she says, one day she's going to conquest the world. So she was an extremely ambitious woman.
She was.
Yeah, and then she was extremely serious. And I think that seriousness must have captured Dr. Hirose's attention because,
Absolutely.
yeah, he seemed like a very, very difficult person to get along with as well.
I can't say, but you know, he was so accomplished as a surgeon that you have to have that seriousness to do what he did. And equally, Kusama is now a household name. She's at the New York Botanical Garden. She's everywhere. And so they they were both so accomplished, and you only get there by having this seriousness and this hard work and this tenacity that they both displayed throughout their careers.
Right. I think I can really see how they connected with each other, and they had a pretty long term relationship,
Mhm.
which is quite unusual because toward the 1963, when her English improves a lot, like, you know, more, uh, her appointments were mostly with the Americans, you know. So
Huh.
she didn't have a lot of connections with Japanese community anymore, but it seems like she really like continued to be a patient and most probably like had a friendship with Dr. Hirose.
Yeah, it's so remarkable.
I think
The
one of the
next
meetings, sorry,
the
meeting was,
next painting to discuss is this incredible large, it's an untitled painting from the mid 1960s. It's incredibly unusual for its scale. As you can see above the fireplace here, it really is a phenomenal scale. It's got these rings of color that are very interesting. The way that infinity nets are rendered is slightly different. Tell us a bit more about how this work is so rare and special.
it's really rare because the date is 1965. And then Kusama told me while I was interviewing her in 1965, around that time, she got cured, from her anxiety neurosis and she couldn't paint anymore. So maybe this is really like the last infinity painting in New York time period. So and then like I think she did come back, but because of some psychotropic drugs that she couldn't paint so finely. This is execution of this painting is pretty
A
uh,
little looser than the
little,
river paintings.
right.
Yeah,
It's looser, but it's not as rough as like say paintings from 1968 or 9.
right,
Um, and the color scheme is very very interesting. During this time, like New York was getting into this psychedelic scene because the drugs were not illegal yet, and Timothy Leary started giving talks at like Cooper Union Hall like in 1965. Kusama happened to be very knowledgeable about these medications because I think it was used for treating some anxiety, neurosis, and so on. And there is a film which is called Kusama's Self-Obliteration. She used
right,
a lot of paintings, which looks very colorful like this particular piece.
right.
So I would categorize this more like belonging to her psychedelic time period. And that, manifested in net painting is very, very rare. And then it has a very nice color tone like ochre
Right.
in the edges are very
Right. The way
nicely.
that yellow sort of goes throughout the work is very interesting.
Yes. And then in the center is also very interesting. It reminds me of her earlier like landscape painting where you see like small trees in the middle.
Huh.
And she says it's like isolation of this, the curtain of something like psychiatric phenomenon that she feels like she got completely like isolated.
Oh,
So,
wow.
so this is definitely a psychedelic um, piece, and I think it's very uh, significant that he owned this painting because I never seen something like this from 65.
No, it's incredibly unusual. It's so important. I've loved talking to you about this because there is so little known about these kind of works, but there's so much background there with her own mental health, what was happening around her in New York. It's just really fascinating. And then speaking of New York, it's there was obviously so much happening in the New York art scene in the 1960s. It's sort of the heart of the global scene in many ways. And as you've said, she exhibited at Brata and at Green Gallery, amongst others. Green Gallery is one of the photos here on the left. And of course, Kusama knew Donald Judd and Claes Oldenburg and Andy Warhol and Joseph Cornell and many, many others. But she didn't always get the recognition that she deserved and she thought she deserved, and she struggled to make headway in many ways. Tell me a bit more about that.
Right. The first time I became very interested in Kusama is when my mother sent me this biography of Kusama written in Japanese. It's now translated as Infinity Net.
Mm-hmm.
And she says, she was the only witness to her career. And then she says all sorts of things, like she was sewing the sculpture before Klaus Oldenburg and all other things. I traced it, by looking into history. And it was quite true that everything what she said was very much correct, uh, like chronological wise. But and I think in the 50s uh, it was very easier for foreigner to come to New York and become successful because like artists such as Yasuo Kuniyoshi was representing the United States at the Venice like in 1950. I don't quite remember exact year, but around 1950. So she was quite successful when she started showing her net painting in 1959. However, this was the time when the younger generation of art dealers came into being, and they promoted new American art. Ironically, the most influential people are really European immigrants to this country, and they were promoting American art.
Right.
So their image of America was more like masculine, men and white. Uh, and then going back to the initial point of that is really this connoisseur of the 60s art scene whose name is Richard Bellamy,
Mm-hmm.
who was a director of the gallery, which you are seeing on the left of your
Yes.
screen right now, the Green Gallery. And he was the one who really selected Andy Warhol and other people in the beginning. And he thought Kusama was very talented. Even before he opened up Green Gallery, he makes an appointment. There is a postcard which remains in University of Austin, Texas archives. It says like, I would like to see your studio.
Wow.
And he must have been very happy to have this, the very big couch with the accumulation
Yeah.
sculpture toward the rear. And I think he really liked Kusama's artwork, but he didn't want to work with her because she was very, very difficult artist and he didn't have a patience for that. But yeah, so there was like her disposition, which was very unusual, that she wanted everyone to treat her as one of the most important artists. And she just came to the United States like in 1957. So I think dealers were a little bit astounded,
Right.
but eventually that became her, I think success that, uh, yeah.
Absolutely. And speaking of the couch, which you see here, that's one of her accumulation works, her soft sculptures, as it were. Those works we'll just touch on briefly, but those are the ones that she says that Claes Oldenburg, the famed pop artist, copied her because she felt that before she started doing that, Claes's work was very hard, very rigid. And then after that, that's when he started doing his soft, sort of stuffed sculpture. And I think he eventually admitted that she was right. Is that true?
According to my friend who wants to remain anonymous, she was interviewing him. And the story came up, and he said, "You can say that she she was one of my influences. And I thought it was a very, very nice gesture of him because, not many people would like to admit that woman artists had certain influence. So I thought it was a very nice story. But, their artworks are really different. So
Yeah.
it's I think it's just about the technique, and he was really looking for a technique in this exhibition on your to your left. He was showing a papier collé, which was a piece of suit, and it had this very soft quality, but he couldn't really, I think, imagine actually sewing the sculpture because he comes from very wealthy, I mean well-to-do Swedish family. The father was
Right.
like a ambassador or consulate, so he comes from very like masculine background,
Right.
and she most probably did give some like good idea about how to make the sculpture softer and yeah, and it was really him who got admitted by the art world with sewing sculptures. So I think that really hurt her.
Right. It's just so interesting, all these connections. And speaking of connections, the Zero Group, who were a German art movement primarily known for Gunther Ucker, Heinz Mack, Otto Pina, as well as the Null Group, which was primarily based in the Netherlands. They got to know Kusama and got to know her works and vice versa. And there was a lot of sort of cross connections there. How did they meet and why did they connect so well?
Right. I know the initial meeting between Kusama and the Null group, and actually she was more close to Henk Peters and
Mm-hmm.
the Null group in the Netherlands. Um, she had advertised her 1961 exhibition with this huge net painting, which was like 33 feet long, and now it's like a legend. And that show was advertised on Art International. Hank Peters had seen it and he immediately connected with her painting that he thought she is someone who is doing nude work in New York. And he
Right,
wrote to her. And then she responded immediately because during this was like 1961, and even before that time she was trying to market her art like in Europe. So when you go over her diary, she sent a lot of like the packages to European galleries, but unexpectedly this interest came from European artists. And then I think their very long and very nice collegial relationship began. There are a lot of like letters that remains between Hank Peters and Kusama that you can see at the University of Texas, Austin.
right,
Yeah, the archives, and I think they connected with each other because they come from very, very similar background, which is a totalitarian society, like, the authoritarianism with imperial government that had deprived freedom from the people. And then they witnessed like two events in the 20th century, which was very cruel. One is Holocaust, and the other one was the atomic bombing.
right,
So I think they had questioned a lot of like civilization, what's been there, and they were very interested in the concept of infinity, which is to build something which was not there but outside of what existed. And I think they used very unusual materials. In fact, Kusama really liked the show called New Forms, New Media, which, introduced a lot of new medium, which wasn't considered as art medium back then. And she really got, understood what null group and zero group wanted to do. And in fact, the picture toward the left is
Mhm.
when Zero Group held their first group exhibition in New York. And Kusama immediately, wanted to meet these people to greet. And she dressed up in this checker pattern dress, which you can see it echoes in Heinz Mack's,
Yes,
artwork in the behind. So she completely understood, their intentions and concepts, and then even dressing herself like one of their artworks, and they went to meet these the three artists and greeted them.
right. I
Yeah.
think the connection with the Zero Group, it's fascinating art historically and aesthetically. There are those connections there, but it also is so fascinating to understand how artists interacted during that time. And I think it highlights something about Kusama that I really learned from your book, which was how conscious she was about PR and her getting her artwork out there. And she took these images, which we have now, which we're so grateful for, of her with her artworks. She really prioritized presenting her works, advertising them in places like Art International, thinking about what to wear when presenting her artworks, which sounds a bit trivial, but to be honest, it shows this seriousness and this thought about her image. And things like Art International were vital in connecting her with the Zero Group. So I think that's just something about her that was something new to me as part of this process, but I think is so important when talking about her time in this period.
I completely agree. And when you look at the right-hand side picture, she's in kimono, and this is
Right.
from Nulu exhibition opening in 1965. And Hank Peters remembers that she was creating artwork at one moment and then disappeared. And next moment she was in the spotlight because she was wearing a silver kimono. So she was very
Amazing.
creative in such a way. And all the men were
Absolutely.
very jealous because she stole the stage. Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, they all have their, it's hard to tell in this, but their black suits on, and a silver kimono is definitely the best thing for a gallery opening. Um, those are all the questions I have for you. I
Yes.
believe we had one question from the audience about the type of paint she was using for these paintings. The works we have at Bonham's are oil on canvas, but yesterday we were talking about the white paint she used. Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, there was her neighbor whose name is Ed Clark. He is now kind of rediscovered black artist.
Yes.
And he had one piece at MoMA and so on. Uh, Ed remembers that he really liked Kusama's white net painting, but he really regrets that the early paintings she could only afford to pay for very cheap white.
Right.
It was all turning into yellow, and he really hoped that she had more money and she could get a better paint.
Right.
So but I think red is quite different. And
Yes.
yes, I was astounded by the quality of Dr. Hirose's collection, that it's in a very good condition, and it's just so amazing. It looks like it was just painted yesterday or something.
They're so vibrant. It's really remarkable how, I mean, they were
Yeah.
well taken care of, which is of course important, but just they just feel so fresh despite, you know, being with us for over 60 years.
Right. And then the depth, created by black is really
Yes.
significant, and it gives another dimension to this painting. which you feel like almost like awe or like, something that evokes, the fear or something like that in you when you look at this picture. It's really amazing painting. Okay, Amy, I think you might be frozen. So probably I can talk a little bit about her clothing. Kusama, when she had like exhibition openings in the 60s, like before Grace Gallery opening, she was really, Amy, I think you're muted now.
Sorry, everyone.
You're
I
muted.
just suddenly lost connection right at the end. Thankfully, we didn't miss anything too important throughout the presentation, but I was just saying thank you to Midori. Thank you so much for joining us, for speaking with me throughout this process. Thank you to everyone who joined us. And if you have any questions at all about the collection or wish to come and see these works, please do email me. You can find my details on our website. And I hope to see some of you in the viewing in the next few days.
Okay. So thank you very much. Okay, bye.
Thanks so much, Midori. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.